Hello and welcome to Authors Die Twice, a podcast on video games and aesthetic theory hosted by two living failures. I'm Nathan Weinstein, and today I'm joined, as always, by a real Lord of Cinder. It's Professor Brian Counter. How are you, Brian?
Not too bad, but yeah, I'm on fire right now because we're having a heat wave over here. So, but yeah, I'm good. I'm good. I'm glad you got me to play Dark Souls 3 again. It's been a long time. I think I basically just played it when it came out and that's been it. So, this has been pretty fun the past few weeks.
Yeah, I guess I'll give a little bit of background here. I we're like halfway to being like a full-time Soulsborne podcast.
Yeah.
But despite that, I was never a huge fan of Dark Souls 3. I thought it was a very accomplished, well-made action adventure game, but it never stuck with me. It didn't have the kind of resonance that I thought all of the other games, even Dark Souls 2, which is sort of the most divisive of the series,
Mhm.
had. But just recently, I was sort of in the mood for a game where you kill things and get better gear. And I thought, well, why not give Dark Souls 3 another try? And this time it just like catapulted up my sort of personal rankings. I was really blown away by it, and so I started getting on Brian and telling him, yeah, let's play Dark Souls 3. Let's talk about Dark Souls 3.
Yeah.
And so here we are. We're gonna chat about maybe the first half of the game or so, and we'll see how many more conversations we get out of it. It might just be one, but we'll at least return to the game one more time to cover the back half in the DLC. So yeah, I think I described it to you. In my pitch to you, I was like, this is basically Elden Ring DLC. It's Elden Ring DLC where there's no open world content. It's just
Yeah.
legacy dungeons built on top of each other. And that's not just because it's a Souls game, but because it actually just graphically, movement wise, mechanically, it feels almost identical to Elden Ring, except for the absence of a jump button. Well, we could talk a bit about what differentiates it, atmospherically, narratively, and gameplay wise from Elden Ring, if anything. But yeah, Brian, where are you at with this game?
So yeah, I think the Elden Ring comparison is a good one, and I do think it's worth thinking about what specifically that means because I think like the ways that enemies are repeated feels like Elden Ring. Like it feels like, of course, a smaller scale Elden Ring, but still demonstrably Elden Ring rather than Dark Souls. Although at the same time, I think I said this to you, it looks quite similar to Dark Souls. Like it does look in certain ways very similar, I think, to obviously the interface, but even some of the areas look quite similar. But then, of course, there are parts that look like Bloodborne or parts that look like Elden Ring. And some of the boss battles certainly seem like they're preparing you for Elden Ring. You know, looking back on it from having played Elden Ring, some of the multi-phase boss battles, some of the aggressive and seemingly more dynamic, boss mechanics, I guess, feel a bit more like Elden Ring. But I think, where I'm at the top of the archive place, and I played a little bit earlier, not very much at all, but I kind of stalled out on. I got to the boss up there, who is Prince something Prince whatever, and then got to the second phase and then died and had to put it down. So hopefully gonna play some more later.
Did the second phase give you General Radon or Consort Radon flashbacks?
Yeah,
Where he
basically.
jumps on, it's Prince Lothric and Prince Lorien, I think.
Yeah.
Lothric is the one who jumps on top of his
Mhm.
brother, starts shooting magic at you while the other guy is swinging his giant sword, which is basically the Radon fight at the end of the DLC.
Yeah,
So maybe if you grind enough, we can co-op that one and have like a sequel
that would be
to.
great.
I'm wondering like if you have any thoughts about the game sort of aesthetically so far. You mentioned it looks like Dark Souls, but also looks like Elden Ring. I think a common critique of this game is that it's pretty generic fantasy. Like kind of castles and dragons, and maybe could be the game that's most easily mistaken for just like your average Western fantasy game, whereas Dark Souls 1 is significantly weirder, one could
Yeah,
say. It's environmental design. Bloodborne, of course, has its own thing.
yeah.
Dark Souls 2 even has its own sort of fairy tale vibe, which is something I might talk about later in the context of Dark Souls 3. But um, I don't know. I found myself new, as I said, like newly impressed by the game on this last playthrough, and I'm not sure I can articulate exactly why yet, because I'm not sure if the environments got more interesting to me. But uh, but yeah, I'm curious as a newcomer, like where you're at right now.
Well, I think one thought I had is that it feels far less silent or quiet than Dark Souls. And Dark Souls 2, like I did play a little bit, but I kind of stalled out. I think it was last year, but I remember even like the kind of string music that plays does definitely have that kind of fairy tale thing to it. I don't only mean sonically silent or quiet though. It does feel busier in certain ways, I would say. So that's obviously a big aesthetic component. I mean, even the shrine bonfire has way more seems like way more people there, and they're just kind of all hanging out. And I think, I know I said the enemies seem to be in packs rather than in even like smaller groups, which is something that feels a lot more like Elden Ring than Dark Souls. So whereas, Dark Souls and maybe to a certain extent Bloodborne feel a little bit more isolated or uh restricted. I mean, I think this is something we talked about a while ago about why we maybe prefer Bloodborne to something like Elden Ring, where it's a lot more restricted, a lot more cohesive in certain ways. And maybe, I don't know if this is like a dumb thing to say, but maybe it is a dumb thing to say, but I'll say it anyway. Maybe the space itself has a kind of narrative to it in a way that an open worlds game doesn't. Um, of course, Dark Souls 3 isn't an open world, but I do feel like it kind of tends in that direction a little bit, like it wants to be one or it wants to be um, more traversable, I suppose, than Dark Souls. It seems a little bit more forgiving in terms of like when you can travel automatically between any of the bonfires. That's obviously a big thing, but I noticed like so many lifts all over the place and so many kind of shortcuts and things like that. That yeah, Dark Souls doesn't really have as much of that, right? You can think of those distinct moments in Dark Souls where you really need to get from one place to another, and you maybe have two ways that you could go, and both of them are going to take you at least 15 minutes if you're like sprinting the whole time, you know?
Yeah.
It doesn't really, obviously there's none of that in this game, so that also makes a huge difference too.
Yeah, which is as we discussed a while ago now with Dark Souls 1, like I think as a result you never really get a sense of how the world fits together in Dark Souls 3, and maybe that's what makes it perhaps somewhat more forgettable or generic seeming just because you're not spending as much time just like looking at it.
Mhm.
It does become something more like a simple backdrop in the way that video game environments often are. You know, you pass through it and then you're done.
Yeah.
Um, and this one interesting thing about Dark Souls 3 is that it's actually like quite linear. There's a couple branching paths, but it's basically just like one dungeon leads to the next one, leads to the next one.
Yeah.
But because you have that teleportation function, um, it can like that faction also sort of recede. So you're just like the main matrix for uh, traversing space in the game is that warping menu, the bonfire menu.
Right.
And that breeds a different sort of spatial or cognitive map, I think, of the world of Lothric than Dark Souls 1 and Bloodborne were. I mean, Bloodborne you can also warp, but there's more mandated backtracking or going back through older areas and finding other paths than there is in 3, where you really can just basically ignore areas that you've already cleared or already beaten the boss for. What do you think of the environments? Like, I mean, there's the big one that I know that you've recently finished, but the environments that are from Dark Souls 1.
Yeah, it was
Just
interesting
like
to,
the sort of, oh, sorry.
well, no, I was just gonna say it was interesting to get to Anor Londo. I also just recently got to the part that repeats within the game too, like the you get to the
Yeah.
kind of smoked out bonfire area place, which is really bizarre. And of course, there's like the only person there, as far as I could tell, was the merchant who just seems to not remember you. Uh, yeah, and Orlando is cool, although I thought it was narratively, I guess, or lore wise, it makes sense that it's going to be kind of in ruins, but it is also kind of strange that it was in a way. And I felt like I wish that there was a lot. It was anticlimactic, I suppose, like approaching the boss arena just right away once I got up to the top, basically. Um, because I always recall that area having a lot of struggle and strife to like sort of get to the very difficult boss in the first place, right? Yeah, I mean, I always like that area. That's I think one of my favorite areas in Dark Souls. But I will say that maybe some of the stuff that's carried over from Dark Souls feels like they more could have been done with it, maybe. Um,
Yeah, I think that's somewhat in line with some of the other sort of fan sentiment I've seen about the game, which is that, or actually, it's a kind of it's maybe it's actually I'm talking out of my ass because I think it's actually the opposite. Like I think what I've seen is fans saying that the game feels like pretty fan servicey at times. So like the first thing you do is walk into a place called Firelink Shrine, and there's the blacksmith from Dark Souls 1,
mhm.
hammering away, and it's a little bit confusing as to why he's there. I think if you go into the lore, there's something about the different periods of this realm kind of being smushed together at the end of days. So space and time are put in a blender, and so that's why Anor Londo is like in the game, but in a different location. It doesn't. It's like not on top of the mountain from Dark Souls 1. Now it's down in the valley,
Yeah,
and on top of this like winter city. But despite the like I guess narrative motivation for that kind of like you know I guess asset reuse or location reuse, it still can feel a bit like, oh hey, do you remember this? Or like
yeah, yeah,
like the game the unchar or the series uncharacteristically going for um a kind of like fan nostalgia or just sort of like pure
yeah,
fan geek out reaction where you're like, oh my God, I can't believe I'm back here. I mean, that's one, right? That would be one pole of the critique, and the other would be yours, which is like, okay, if you're going to bring that stuff back, like maybe make it a bit more fleshed out rather than being a kind of like, yeah, fan service, like a sort of like one small area that has the big show-stopping moment of like the name appearing
yeah.
on the screen that we know from the first game, but actually in terms of its real estate and its explorability, is somewhat lacking.
Yeah, I mean, it could be, it certainly should, and could and should be in ruins still, of course, if it's like coming back from whatever other time it was in the first game. But having only like a tenth of it or a fifth of it or however much it is without much else, it's just like it's the same area with just different enemies, and there's other than like the kind of few different iconic places where there's the boss battle and whatever, that's kind of it. Like there's no, there's no, you don't get access to a different part that conceivably could have been there in Dark Souls 1, but it's behind a closed door or something like that. Um, there's no like secret from Dark Souls or whatever. The other thing though, what you said about fan service in that way and in maybe one or two other ways, this it does feel Dark Souls 3 does feel more like a video game or something, if that makes sense. Like the first moment I really felt this was when you are in that awful swamp area and you have to turn off like shut out the fires or whatever, and the first time you do it, it like pans the camera up to this door or whatever. And it's the most heavy-handed, I think, of any cutscene in a From Software game that I can think of. Because so many of them, I think of the ones in Bloodborne that are so bizarre and so kind of surreal, like the thing where you touch like someone touches the skull or like there are those moments that have you have to kind of piece them together, and something where it's pointing the camera directly at what's happening, but not only pointing it, it's like a tracking shot, right? Because something similar happens in Dark Souls where you ring, I think it's when you ring both bells and it shows a giant like opening a gate. And even that is still a little bit obscure because you're not sure how to get there. You're not really, there's a little bit of mystery to it still. But yeah, this weird panning tracking shot was kind of, yeah, it felt weird. It's like, what are the Dark Souls players rusty now and they have to think they need this help or whatever? I don't know.
Yeah, the Dark Souls players have gone hollow. Their sort of brain cells have deteriorated like everybody else. But no, that's such a great point. I completely missed that. But of course, I think you're totally right. That's the gamiest thing I've ever seen in a FromSoft game. You turn on, I mean, first of all, the idea like you have to light three fires,
Yeah, yeah,
turn on, it's like basically turn on these three generators to open a door,
yeah,
uh,
yeah,
that you might get in like a whatever, like yeah, just your Gears of War or something.
yeah,
But yeah, I mean, you're also comparing it to that moment in Dark Souls 1 where you ring the bell, like in principle the same idea, right?
yeah,
Like you're lighting two beacons, you're pulling two switches to open the big gate that leads you to the next area. But of course, it's expanded over, miles in Dark Souls 1, and you're venturing down these windy paths, from one area to another, often completely disoriented. And as you say, like you may ring that second bell and just have no idea what the camera is even showing when it pans to Sen's fortress and the gate opening. But yeah, that's it. You're right. It's a totally atypical moment in both cases because we're then seeing things that our protagonist isn't present for, which, as I think now, I'm like I don't really know if that happens in Souls games once you move past the opening cutscene, right? Like,
yeah,
you're pretty tethered to the protagonist's time and space, even though they themselves, as we've discussed, have very little in terms of actual sort of psychological interiority or awareness.
yeah,
But what we see is still more or less filtered entirely through what they're experiencing.
right,
So the very fact of having the video game director camera saying, "Okay, here, look at this other thing,"
yeah,
is exceptional and somewhat anomalous.
yeah,
But yeah, like in the swamp, it's a totally different thing because it's within that area. It's like
right,
not like the player needs to venture more than a few hundred feet to find the door that the cutscene was gesturing towards. It does make me wonder why it was deemed necessary. I would, for if this were any other game series, you would know exactly why it's necessary, because this is a game convention. But Souls games are so resistant and stubbornly resistant in most cases to these game conventions that ease friction, right? Like they seem completely unconcerned with wasting the player's time, with producing that moment where you flip a switch and it's like, okay, like what did that do? Or what is this key for? That's a classic Souls experience. You pick up a key and it's clearly a key, but it's like old key, it's like like what am I supposed to do with this?
yeah,
It could
yeah.
be somewhere like on the other side of the realm. Um, and it's just some nondescript door. So yeah, that does seem like a moment where like really like a lowest common denominator moment, even though I've never noticed it and never minded it because honestly, like I like how Dark Souls 3 eliminates a lot of the tedium. Or if I don't like it, I or maybe like's not the word. It's like I sort of I don't resist it. I'm kind of like, okay, great. Like let's make this a bit more of a chill experience. I'm down with that.
Yeah, I mean, it does, I think this is something else we've spoken about, but it does make me really think about the phenomenon, which I'm sure is shared. I'm not the only person who said this, but I love Dark Souls, but when I think about Dark Souls, every area sucks, and I hate playing through like when you play through the game, you're constantly, especially after you've played it once or twice, you get to a new area and you're like, this area, and then you finish it and you get to the next one, you're like, nope, this is even worse. And yet you love it, and it's not. I highly resist the idea that it's just some kind of masochism or like difficulty for difficulty's sake. I think there's something else that's going on there. Or if that's the case, it's not conscious. I don't think it's like this kind of uh annoying, like I want to be punished in my game thing, because I don't really feel that way actually when I'm playing. I want to like in fact comfortably defeat the enemy so I can just keep moving around in the world. I don't think it's really so much like a yeah, I don't know. Maybe that's something else to think about. I'm not sure actually my full thoughts about that. But anyway, I guess that also, I'd maybe agree in a certain sense that I would appreciate some of the more hand-holding parts if they weren't so blatant or something like this. And yet I would probably, after taking a step back and evaluating the game, still not want them. I think that's kind of how I would maybe feel about that.
Yeah, I think I want to say on principle, I don't want them, but
Yeah.
I'm weak-willed. And so when they're offered to me, I'm like,
Yeah,
sure,
sure.
yeah, I'll take it. It's like the way Dark Souls 3 also basically eliminates the boss run back, in the way that Elden Ring
Mhm.
does, which had already started to be tapered, with Bloodborne.
Yeah.
But Dark Souls 3, it's like pretty, you basically never have to run more than, again, like a few hundred feet to get to a boss, if that. And oftentimes you'll have a shortcut right before the boss door,
Yeah.
or a bonfire. But I'm not gonna lie and say that whenever I have a bonfire before a boss, I'm like, hell yeah, this is great. Like, thank God I don't have to like walk across the entire map again, if I fail. And in fact, the Lothric and Lorien fight is one of the more tedious boss runs in the game because you have to make your way across that bridge full of enemies who are like poking at you.
Yeah.
And even that's incredibly
Not that
tame
bad.
by
Yeah.
Dark Souls 1 standards. That's nothing, but for Dark Souls 3, it's pretty onerous.
Well, I think
Um,
in Dark Souls, the thing that I always that really strikes me about the boss run back is that you always every time need to make the decision whether you're going to conservatively and slowly defeat all the enemies so none of them can kind of take you by surprise and then get to the boss with all your resources intact, or just try to run through them and risk getting turned around and getting hit a bunch and having to like use up resources before you even get to the boss. And especially if you're trying to summon an NPC or something like that, it can be even more problematic because if the enemies catch you, they can kill your NPC conceivably, or like mess up the animation when you're trying to summon them or whatever. Um, so that I mean that's an element that I think is really kind of engaging in Dark Souls, when you actually need to make decisions about how you're going to, before you even get to the thing you're trying to do, like how you're going to get there and what sort of strategy you'll use. And again, I think yeah, I mean I'm at that exact place right now in the battle that's up the top of that big staircase, and there are just a ton of enemies there. And I started off just trying to beat them all, and then I realized it's way easier to just run past them, and there's kind of no stakes in it.
yeah, I want to go back quickly to what you said about the way and I take it that you don't mean this about Dark Souls 3, and maybe that's part of what distinguishes it from the others, is that what did you mean it's just Dark Souls 1 where every area sucks?
No, I think what I meant is not that like I don't like the look of the area or anything. I think I mean I my first version of this was Dark Souls, which is I love this game, but it sucks to play through these areas.
Yeah, yeah.
You get
No,
to
for
Blight,
sure.
you
Yeah.
get to Blighttown, Blighttown sucks. You get to Sen's Fortress sucks. Like it's and there's a it's I don't know, maybe it's just because I'm thinking more about horror media lately, but there's kind of like an element to horror, I think, in this, which is that that it's going to be really hmm, I don't know if it's horror. There's something about it which is it's going to be a real challenge, and it will be not like a horror related jump scare, but there will be jump scares of difficulty in getting through the level, and that's why I say that it sucks. Like I
Yeah.
love these areas, they're really beautiful. Even Blighttown, I have an appreciation for, like thinking back on it, like how that area ends and how you kind of wind up in that swamp down below, which is, I think, the best Dark Souls related swamp for sure. I especially I hate the one in Dark Souls 3, but this one in at the end of Blighttown is great. Um, but every time you get to Blighttown and you see that really, I guess, speaking of another aesthetic thing, in Dark Souls, the color palette will just very abruptly and like kind of wildly change when you get into a new area, which doesn't, I think, happen in Dark Souls 3. But when that color palette changes to whatever it is, you're in like the green kind of valley, and then you walk into Blighttown and it's this like disgusting brown area, you have like a sigh of, you're doomed or something like that.
Yeah, well, I mean that's great because that's what that's sort of what I thought you were saying, and it I wonder just without testing this thought at all. I wonder if that is another um, distinctive feature, not maybe not a unique feature, but a distinctive feature of the series,
Mhm.
which is this is a very niche sort of issue or experience, but I think it's one shared by a lot of Dark Souls obsessives, who play these games again and again. Like when you think back, when I'm entertaining the idea of playing one of these games again. You're exactly right, is that I'll eventually get to the place where I'm like, well, but do I really want to do Blighttown again? Do
Yeah,
I really
yeah.
want to do like I felt this very acutely because I'm now 100 hours into a playthrough of Dark Souls 2.
Mhm.
And I had to really convince myself to play it. I've really enjoyed it, but when I was thinking of playing Dark Souls 2, I was like, well, do I really want to do those couple areas where you're just mobbed by enemies? Dark Souls 2, the Scholar of the First Sin, sort of director's cut edition, which is now the standard edition, um, like has so many just huge gangs of enemies who will just overwhelm you, and it can be honestly just really tedious, really miserable to play.
Yeah.
And that does seem distinct, that thought of like there's this specific area in the game. It's almost like you're sort of narratively inhabiting the game as you proleptically imagine replaying, so sort of like jumping into the future of something that you've already done, or reliving a memory, through a second playthrough. So it has a kind of mnemonic or temporal sort of scissoring movement that's maybe worth flagging, but um, that it's like it's so imminent to the game world and to its fiction, to its represented world. It's like, okay, there is this place in the world of the game that I don't want to have to experience again. Whereas when I think of like replaying other games, it's often the mechanics that will give me pause, So for example, I was pondering recently playing through Final Fantasy VIII again, and Final Fantasy VIII has this. I probably will play it because it's a great game and a really interesting one, but it has this basic system called the draw system, which is how you get your magic. In Final Fantasy VIII, you don't learn magic; you have to acquire it as an item, and the main way you do it is from foregoing a turn of attacking
Yeah.
during battle to take it from your enemy.
Yeah.
So it's like if I want more fire, uses of fire, I have to draw it from like the bomb enemy that I find out in the world map. But of
Yeah.
course, you only get like 4 copies of fire, like from the bomb,
Mm.
So it's like if I wanted to get 99 uses of fire, I'd have to spend 10 minutes just like eating damage, 20 minutes maybe, just wasting all my turns drawing, acquiring 4 or 5 uses of fire at a time. It's an incredibly tedious system, even though it is pretty interesting in what it's trying to do. It definitely has advantages, but this is all to say when I'm considering playing that game, I'm like, God damn it, I can't draw more magic. And of course you can play the game without drawing magic or fun, there are actually pretty effective ways of getting around that requirement. But the basic existence of it makes me sort of sours me on the idea. Or if I think of like playing through another open world game. I'm like, do I really want to have to like start my character from level 0 and do all those bandit camps to like get them up to a decent level where I can use some interesting abilities, or make some interesting choices?
Yeah.
So these are mechanical, right, obstacles to replaying games. There are issues with like the framework of frameworks of progression, frameworks of character building, or just basic interaction with the game world. Whereas when I'm thinking of playing another game of Dark Souls, actually the idea of building a character is really exciting to me. It's like what makes me want to play.
Yeah.
to do another run through one of the games.
Yeah.
And it's like particular bosses or particular spaces.
Right.
Even spaces within certain levels. Like I will always
Yeah.
remember this one room in the Iron Keep in Dark Souls 2, where just there are all these knights that just like they just come out of the shadows and they're just shooting arrows at you, and and the game wants you to take on five, six at a time, which is just totally unfair. Um, does that seem right to you? Like, can you think of other games where it's a particular space, or location that kind of makes you feel uneasy or uncomfortable or tense or just annoyed, when you think about playing a game?
I think the biggest kind of version of that that I can think of is boredom, like which is not exactly what I mean by Dark Souls. I think sometimes it can be boring, I guess. Sometimes you'll be like, I just don't really want to play through this area. But I think actually more so I love this area. It's beautiful. It's like amazing to be inside, but also it's horrible because it's very difficult. And actually that makes me think of I other than maybe the boss fights, I don't think Eh, maybe I don't know if this is fair to say, but I think I would say on the whole, I think Dark Souls 3 is not as difficult as Dark Souls. I mean, I don't have this game etched in my mind the way that I do with Dark Souls. So, um, it's as if I'm playing it for the first time, kind of, because I think, again, I think I played it basically when it came out, and that was a while, long time ago. So essentially playing it in that way, there have been levels where I've basically gotten through the level without much of a difficulty and gotten to the boss and then beat the boss. And I think that's different from how it feels in Dark Souls, but it also makes me think that there's like a question of repetition. I think of course like everybody probably talks about repetition with Dark Souls because you die. That's you just keep dying or whatever. But I also think that's become a little bit overblown maybe in the way that we talk about these games. Like I think it's possible to actually get through a level, maybe not 100% clearing everything in the level, but getting from bonfire to bonfire, like without too much of a difficulty on like a first try. That will happen sometimes, and there's not that much repetition. I actually think that the more interesting kind of repetition, as experientially, that you just kind of mentioned is I love the repetition of leveling up a bunch as a lower level character. And there's something really nice about you start a new character and it's like you like fall in love with leveling up for a little bit and then it becomes tedious and you're kind of tired of it after a while where it's like I got 50,000 souls, I guess I better get back to the bonfire before I lose them, like and I can get one level or something like that. Whereas when you first start off and you're able to like see the changes that happen when you do level up, there's something about that kind of repetition early in the game and across games that is really exciting about I think all of the Souls games.
Yeah, because those early levels have such shaping power, right?
Yeah.
Like, that you really are molding your character into the person that they'll be, into the monster slayer that they'll be.
Right.
Um, Whereas later on, you're just kind of like, it's like I can get another point of vigor. Great. That's
Yeah, yeah.
probably good. Like, it's
I
that like
have to do this 10 more times before it makes a difference.
exactly. But yeah, what you said about repetition is also interesting because I would agree. I think Dark Souls 3 is by far the easiest of the Dark Souls games.
Yeah.
And if you can include Bloodborne in there too, and maybe even Elden Ring, just because Elden Ring has the kind of forgiving open world structure, but the boss fights I think
Yeah.
are on average harder.
Yeah.
Um, so it has like again like it sort of it eliminates a lot of the friction that you associate with Dark Souls and feels it has this weird just like it's like at once going for fan service but also going for quote unquote epic
Yeah. Yeah.
these big moments there's spectacle in the way that there's spectacle where other Souls games would have silence.
Mm.
And I don't say that as a critique, 'cause I actually really like that aspect. I sort of embraced it this time playing through it and was like, I don't know, it's sort of bombastic moments of Dark Souls 3, like when you're fighting that giant knight and there's like moths shooting giant like fire moths shooting fire at you, and it's just like there's a lot of stuff going on at the same time on
Yeah.
that bridge right before the Grand Archives.
Yeah.
That stuff was actually pretty cool, but it does feel out of character for the series. But what I wanted to sort of touch on actually was what you said about repetition, because if to go back to one of our earlier, questions of this game, whereas maybe some of the gameplay repetition has been sanded off, there is this sort of thematics of repetition in the game of things from the past, things from the series past or series memory, reappearing in unexpected new contexts.
Right.
And one thing that's striking me about that is that it's actually Dark Souls 2 already did that, and Dark Souls 2 does it in a much bolder and interesting way.
Mm.
So it is itself a repetition. I could be wrong on the lore here, but I think a pretty emblematic example comes from the beginning of Dark Souls 2, where you actually do find Anor Londo in that game too, but it's like underwater.
Mm.
Um, so it's almost unrecognizable, but you can see like the old that sort of iconic cathedral or the ruins of it. Um, I'm pretty sure there's some implication that that actually is Anor Londo, and that even in Dark Souls 2's version of this realm, space has already started to sort of bend back on itself, and the locations are appearing in new contexts, right? Like it's hard to imagine geologically what could lead Anor Londo to be at the very top of Mount Olympus or whatever, and then now be Atlantis, right? Be underwater.
Yeah, yeah.
But so that happens in Dark Souls 2, but in Dark Souls 2, it's done with a bit more of that kind of resistance and silence that you'd associate with Dark Souls 1, in that um, the game doesn't call any of the things, or calls very few of the things from Dark Souls 1 by their original names.
Mm.
So um, it, like it'll very often say, this is a sword that belonged to a great lord or something, and it's like, oh, that's a sword from Dark Souls 1, but the names have been forgotten because in the fiction of the game, thousands of years have passed. And not only that, but through these cycles of repetition again, of dying and rebirth, the various denizens of this realm have like lost their minds and can't remember anything. So on a local sort of character level too, like nobody remembers why they're there or what their purpose was. And more broadly, like nobody remembers Dark Souls 1, so it's a sequel where it's a sequel that that is afflicted with amnesia about its predecessor, um, and that, to sort of go full circle, that extends to the reuse or the reappearance of certain locations. Whereas Dark Souls 3 is the one that's like very sort of flamboyantly about like all the different realms of Lordran and Lothric combining, and so we see that happening in a more spectacular way, but it's also just signaled so much clearer. Like you go to Anor Londo, and the game tells you you are in Anor Londo, or you'll find the blacksmith, you'll find like Solaire's sword or something, or Havel's ring, right? These items from the original Dark Souls, and they're just called what they're called. In Dark Souls 2, again, like even if you get an item from the first game, it's totally rusted or warped beyond, almost beyond recognition, and either is no longer associated with a name, but just with a concept, or it's been misnamed, or named something else.
Right.
Um, and so they're just two really different approaches to series continuity and series retrospection, you know. Um, and I guess I'm repeating myself here, but it is really striking having playing them back to back in my Souls series replay, like how yes, how thematized it is in Dark Souls 3, and yet it's like Dark Souls 3 says it but doesn't like live it, like it says the repetition but doesn't live it, whereas like Dark Souls 2, which is a far inferior game, I think in a lot of ways to Dark Souls 3, but still like it's much it commits to and is more authentic about the prospect of um recursion and repetition, and what it says about that is that with enough recursion and repetition, you actually forget what anything's called, and you actually forget the fact that it's like repeated, or it's things actually start to lose their distinctness and lose their identity, rather than having it solidified and kind of reified in the way it is, the way it is in the sequel.
So yeah, that's interesting then, because then the progress from one to two to three, and I'll have to play through two again so we can talk about that at some point soon. But if two forgets everything and has like I wonder about the reconstruction then that would have to occur for three to remember like what is forgotten in two. Not necessarily that they're linear, I guess, but like even just in terms of the series one, two, three, like to get back to three and suddenly remember, oh yeah, this is Anne Orlando and it's, it's no longer underwater or whatever. I understand that it's like there's some temporal stuff happening as well. But that's
No,
kind
but
of
that's a really great point because I hadn't even thought of this, but what if everyone forgot everything in Dark Souls 2, even to the point of forgetting the name of the realm? It's called Drangleic or
yeah,
Drangleic or something in Dark Souls 2, and the at certain points the game will say, oh, someone a character will be like, this place used to be called something else, but nobody remembers what it was.
right.
But in Dark Souls 3, it's like the names are all back. So how did everybody regain their memories, or how did the game interface regain its memory? Because that's also something that could be happening, right? In Dark Souls 2, it's
Yeah,
not just that you just forget things, but the interface has forgotten things too. The
right.
interface could still tell us this is Havel's ring, but nobody in the world knows who Havel is anymore,
Yeah.
and in fact, no character in the game, just to bring up one sort of like iconic Dark Souls 1 NPC, like as far as I remember, no character in Dark Souls 3 will mention like someone like Havel. It'll usually be the item description. So it's still the interface, it's still the system speaking to the character, addressing the player and making these connections. Um,
Hmm.
so we could say that the system then is where the memory, like it's it's not a character that says you're back in Anor Londo. Like it's the game interface, right?
Right,
It's your
right.
HUD.
Yeah.
So maybe the interface sort of was cured of its amnesia, you know. Um, uh, but it's, I'm not sure. Like I sort of, I wonder if the implication is that characters in the in the world of Dark Souls 3 do have a bit more understanding of the past, of identities, and names. Um, they don't seem to be afflicted with the mass dementia that has occurred in Dark Souls 2. Of course, one of the things, sorry to sort of monologue here, but I guess the last turn of the screw here is that one of maybe the only thing that Dark Souls 3 forgets is Dark Souls 2, because the game wasn't, I think, whatever the cynical read would be that the game wasn't very popular. And so Dark Souls 3 is like, oh, the stuff in Dark Souls 2 doesn't really matter. We're just going to do fan service references to Dark Souls 1. I mean, there are a few references to Dark Souls 2, but they're pretty buried and pretty rare compared to how much Dark Souls 1 stuff gets recycled, or reactivated. You really have to go out of your way to find the Dark Souls 2 references in Dark Souls 3. Um, so it is actually like, oh, this is like that middle, work in the trilogy is the one that the finale is like, oh, actually, we don't really need to concern ourselves too much with what happened in that one. Like this is all about going back to the beginning.
Well, it's strange, one thing I'm thinking about now is like reusing, and this is maybe why to come back to the fan service thing, the fact that it feels maybe more like a game, and also the fact that those, reused areas feel a little bit underwhelming, is that the very game, like the game-like sort of tendency with franchise characters at least appearing across multiple things is, I think about like the Mario, whatever, like Smash Brothers or something, or whatever, like Cinemat Marvel Cinematic Universe or something like that, where you people just get excited simply because they see the character appearing again, or like you see the thing appear and that's the thing that like does it for you and that's it. And you don't really have to have any development or uh de-development, which is kind of what would have to happen in Dark Souls, right? Like it's not like the characters are going to come back or the area is going to come back looking nicer. It's always going to be messed with in some way. Um I'm not really sure where that would lead me, but I think that's something pretty important. Like this is why like, I think what needs to repeat from game to game is not simply the identity or the name of some place or thing, but actually something a lot more formal or something like deeper that has to do with it, which
Mm.
is, which is the yeah, like it's not, you don't go into Anne Orlando and go, here we go, like yeah, like everyone at the movie theater like throwing their popcorn around and stuff. Like you get to Anne Orlando and it's kind of like, whoa, okay, I like this area, that's cool, but it's also very quickly you realize that it's this kind of tiny fragment of Anne Orlando. And it's not even, I mean, sure, it's a fragment in the sense that, the bridges are broken off, so you can't really use the full thing. You can only go to like a couple of the floors rather than all of them or whatever. And even the actual castle, you can only go straight in. You can't really do anything else. Um, so it's fragmentary in that sense, but it's also just like you don't even get to see the ruins of it. There's no reason or there's no inaccessible part that you can kind of look at least. It just kind of actually feels like it's cut off and like snipped off from the rest of it. So it feels like it's an excerpt rather than a ruin or something like that. That's the thing that's weird, right? It doesn't feel like you're actually discovering it again. It just feels like you're being told it again or something like this.
Yeah, yeah. So like yeah, I like that a lot. Like kind of a sort of strict repetition as opposed to
Like a
something more
rediscovery.
realized. Yeah,
Yeah,
rediscovery. Yeah, yeah. Which is sort of like how it works in Dark Souls too. Like something utterly transformed, right? Where we actually have to work to realize that this is the place that we thought we knew.
right.
Um, and again, like the kind of like confluence narrative, space-time confluence narrative, apocalyptic narrative of Dark Souls 3 is like you could say it. I mean, maybe this is just a rephrasing of what we were saying earlier, but it's like what it narratively motivates is precisely fan service because it does authorize you to just snip out like a section of the game that you know from, like from an earlier game and just plant it somewhere else, and so you're not actually um, integrating it into some new history or culture, which is exactly what Dark Souls 2 does. Like Dark Souls 2 stages, and I think it stages in a really like brilliant way, like just the death of a culture and the birth of a new one, or a kind of description and forgetting of an environment. Um, Whereas Dark Souls 3, it is, as you say, like a repetition. It's like, oh, this is just this thing that we just lifted out of time from that you remember almost exactly as it was, except that the light is a little bit different. Um, and have planted it here in a in an unexpected place. But it still preserves its integrity, and that's what makes it able to maybe evoke that reaction of like, oh my God, I can't believe we're here, which I know that you said you didn't feel, but I would imagine we could go on YouTube and find some like
Sure. Yeah,
Dark
yeah.
Souls 1 fan reacts to finding Anne Orlando or whatever, and they're like sort of like losing their minds or whatever when Dark Souls 3 came out. Um, but but yeah, by saying it narratively motivates fan service, that sounds like such a put down, but I don't necessarily mean it as such. It's more just like this is the currency of Dark Souls 3, or this is what Dark Souls 3 is interested in doing, And to go back to my first comment about replaying the game, I think part of what made me enjoy it more was finding a kind of peace with that, and sort of accepting the roller coaster theme park for Dark Souls, yeah, sort of Dark Souls theme park aspect of this game, for what it is,
Yeah.
so maybe that's something we could resume with um next time we talk about the game.
Sure. Yeah, it sounds good to me. Let's burn that bone fragment and make sure that magic lantern is +1.
Thank you, thank you. All right, see you, Brian.
See ya.